Okay. So again, welcome everybody. We're so glad you joined us tonight for Climate Action California's special webinar on Is California High-Speed Rail on Track? And before we start the presentation, we're going to go a little bit over some housekeeping just briefly. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentation so we don't have background noise. And also, feel free to go off camera if you like, or you could stay on. It's your choice. We are recording, and we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So please hold your questions till then. But you're welcome to drop them into the chat as we go along so you don't forget. I'm going to be collecting those questions in the chat and posing them in kind of a logical order to Jonathan at the question and answer time. So next screen or next slide. And just before we start again, I want to give a little background on Climate Action California to those who may be new to us. We are a nonprofit based in California with a reach beyond California, though. We have 11,000 supporters, mostly in California, but also nationwide. And what distinguishes us is that we advocate for science-based climate legislation and regulation, and we're almost entirely volunteer run with only 2 people on staff. And we're all working together for an equitable, low carbon future. And you can see from the photo, we're a very friendly bunch and very active. And we welcome you to get involved if you aren't yet. We'll share ways at the end to get involved with Climate Action California. So with that, I think it's time to introduce our speaker. I am delighted to introduce to you all Jonathan Cole. He's going to guide this presentation. He joined Climate Action California as the transit co-lead or transit lead on the transportation team after teaching physics at Mira Acosta College for 36 years and developing a course in climate change. He also co-authored 2 chapters in the 2019 University of California climate textbook, Bending the Curve. High-speed rail is a personal passion of Jonathan's as he currently lives a car-free life in San Francisco. And he and Judy Borsch, who's on the call and helping in the background, they both, Judith leads our transportation team and Jonathan is the transit lead for it. And so we're delighted, the team is delighted to put this on. So, and just who I am, I'm Linda Hutchins Knowles. I am the volunteer coordinator for Climate Action California. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan to take it away. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, hi. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. So we're going to today be looking at high-speed rail, what the history is, what the current status is, where it might be going in the future. And I'll try to keep the rail metaphors to a minimum, but it does feel lately like this is almost more of a roller coaster. Actually, the whole 10 years have been something of a roller coaster. But just in the last month since we decided to put together this webinar, there's been a lot of ups and downs. We had Governor Newsom, who proposed a major funding boost for high-speed rail. And then at the beginning of this month, a proposed cut where the federal administration, under the current administration, is going to try to possibly claw back a significant funding. So we'll talk about all of that. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the vision for high-speed rail and what the reality is right now. And it's often when you get in these discussions, we just talk about how long it's going to take, how much it's going to cost. It seems almost impossible that we could build a high-speed rail system. But this is the reality around the world, especially Europe and East Asia. So in Europe, you can take a Eurostar from Paris to London in cover 300 miles in about 2.25 hours. In Japan, they've had high-speed rail since 1964. Similar distance, Tokyo, Osaka, you can cover in 2.5 hours by rail. And they're actually building a line that will cut that time in half. Tokyo to Osaka, over 300 miles in just over an hour. And of course, China has built over 25,000 miles of high-speed rail just since the beginning of the century, including one of the longest high-speed rail lines in the world, which covers almost 820 miles from Beijing to Shanghai in about 4 hours. So this is the normal reality every place. Why can't we build it here in California? In fact, why is it taking so long? And again, as Linda mentioned, if questions come up as I'm going along, please put them in the chat and she will organize to get sort of a logical sequence of stuff and hopefully try to answer as much as we can. towards the end. So what is the vision for high-speed rail? The California High-Speed Rail Project, which has been under construction for about 10 years now, the idea is ultimately it would be a system that would cover most of the major cities in California, including traveling from San Francisco to Los Angeles, 440 miles in less than 3 hours. There is another high-speed rail project, of course, that is just gearing up for construction now, which is Brightline West. This is a privately funded project, which would go from Las Vegas almost to Los Angeles, Las Vegas to Rancho Cucamonga in 218 miles in about 2 hours. So we're going to focus today on California High-Speed Rail Project, but I'll mention Brightline a couple times and can answer questions about that in the chat. So we've got, this is the vision. This is what we're looking towards. What's the reality right now? If I want to go, and I've done this a few times, to take rail from San Francisco to Los Angeles, what does that look like today? The current reality is there's a train called the San Joaquins. It's a diesel locomotive. It's a reasonably nice new train, but it's diesel and it travels through the Central Valley. You can see on the map, we don't actually go from San Francisco. Oh, before I get too far, I should mention this is being rebranded. So at some point in the near future, you'll probably hear it referred to as the Gold Runner, which for some of us seems like an overly PR-ish kind of name, but it's a phased rollout is what they're saying. I'm going to ignore it for right now, and we'll use the traditional San Joaquin's name, but just be aware that this rebranding is ongoing. So to get on the San Joaquins, first, if you're in San Francisco, you have to get over to the East Bay where the line starts. There's no direct rail service to San Francisco here. That will probably add about a half hour to your trip, depending on how you go. That's optimistic, could be more. Then finally, you get on the San Joaquin's train and you're whisked to Bakersfield in a mere 6.5 hours. And when you get to Bakersfield, obviously, if you're going to Los Angeles, you're not quite there yet. It turns out there is no rail service, passenger rail service between Bakersfield and Los Angeles. There is a freight line, but it's very slow, very congested with freight trains. So instead, you get on a bus. So it's the Amtrak bus, perfectly nice bus. It's an Amtrak bus, so it coordinates. You're not gonna, the bus isn't gonna leave before the train gets there, but it's a bus, which means it's cramped. You can't spread out. You can't work on your laptop. You can't do the things you could do on the train. One of the primary advantages of the train over flying is you've got much more room. You can stand up and walk around. Can't do that on the bus. So you take the bus to California or to Los Angeles. That's going to take you about 2.5 hours. So the whole trip is a mere 9.5 hours from San Francisco to Los Angeles. That seemed fast in the 19th century, but in the 21st century, not so much. If you're going by car, if you allow for a couple of breaks, you can make it in maybe 6 or 7 hours. If you fly, you're only in the air for an hour, but of course you've got to get to the airport, go through security, boarding, get from the airport to your destination. So we're talking maybe 4 hours. So that's still less than half the time by train, which is why not a lot of people take this train route at this point. I should mention there is another rail route, the Coast Starlight, that only runs one train a day in each direction. It's a beautiful scenic route, but it takes about 11 hours from Los Angeles to San Jose, about 12 hours to San Francisco, or vice versa. So not exactly modern high-speed rail. If we compare the modes here, San Joaquin's, it's slow because you're sharing track with freight. These are lines that were laid out in the 19th century. The average speed's about 50 miles per hour, primarily because if you go faster than that, you're going to come up against freight trains. And this, you can frequently be delayed. You may end up arriving late because of conflicts with freight. These lines are owned by the freight companies. And even though passenger rail is supposed to have priority, conflicts show up. And as I said, it takes 9.5 hours. It's not rail all the way. It requires a bus segment. So not something that's going to pull folks unless you're already in the Central Valley or you're a high-speed rail or a rail fan in general. High-speed rail would have an average speed over 3 times that fast, about 170 miles per hour, would be able to go up to 200 miles per hour running on dedicated high-speed track exclusively for passengers. So you wouldn't have the freight conflicts. And that would allow for San Francisco to LA in about 3 hours. So there's a clear speed advantage for high-speed rail. We're a climate organization, so we want to look at emissions, and there's a clear emissions advantage. These are diesel-powered locomotives, the San Joaquins. Right now, they're new locomotives. They're what are called Tier 4 locomotives, which emit the least particulates and NOx of any diesel engines operating, but they still emit CO2. And when I first started taking the train, I thought I'm being really virtuous. I'm not emitting so much because I'm taking the train, not flying. Disappointing to learn that a diesel train has emissions very similar to flying. You're really not saving on emissions if you go by the train currently. High-speed rail, on the other hand, is electric power. It's what's called overhead catenary. You can see in the picture the electric lines running above the train. That's where the train gets its power. And the plan is to build dedicated solar facilities to provide that electricity so that, and obviously you would have to use some energy storage as well, but the power would be coming from renewable sources. So the operations of the train would have essentially zero emissions. So lots of advantages there. What would the route look like? This is the planned route for the full high-speed rail system, which would run San Francisco to LA and on to Anaheim, but also up to Sacramento and down to San Diego. One question that's often asked is, why don't we just build it up I-5? Wouldn't that be a lot faster? And the answer is, yeah, it definitely would be. But this is intended to be California high-speed rail, not San Francisco, LA high-speed rail. And you can debate whether that's a good decision or not. But the idea here is that this system, which would be 770 miles in total, would let you get from San Francisco to LA in 3 hours. And it would cover most of the major population centers in California. So here the circles are representing the 5 largest cities in California. The yellow blobs are very rough designations of the most populous parts of San Francisco, California. And if we add up those population numbers, you can see the big numbers are in Los Angeles area and San Francisco Bay Area. If you're a private company like Brightline West, you would say, hey, let's get the biggest bang for the buck. We'll just go between these major markets, San Francisco, LA. This is a state-funded project. Part of the intention is to cover as much of the population of California as possible, and to especially provide service through the Central Valley, which is economically depressed, and there would be tremendous economic opportunities from fast links to the Bay Area and Los Angeles. If we add up all these population numbers, that's about 36.5 million people who would be in reasonable distance of a high-speed rail station. And that amounts to about 93% of the population of California. So the system is designed to provide high-speed rail service for the vast majority of Californians, not just from Los Angeles to San Francisco. So we're calling this now phase 2. This is the phase 2 system because the original, this is the full system that we would love to see. In practice, it was decided early in the 2000s, before Prop 1A was approved in 2008, to go for a truncated system. So this would be 494 miles, and we're going to see a lot of truncation going on here. This is a 494-mile system, which would run from San Francisco to Anaheim, not including the Sacramento and San Diego branches. But this would still cover about 77% of the California population. This is pretty much what was envisioned when Prop 1A was approved in 2008. And here I'm just showing the major stations. There would actually be 13 stations along the line. So 4 stations in the Central Valley and additional stations in the other branches. So this is phase 1 of high-speed rail. When Prop 1A was approved, approving bonds to fund high-speed rail, it was projected that this system would be complete in 2020. And you've probably noticed that didn't happen. So where are we now? Why don't we have this full system? It's a long story, and I'm going to have to truncate it quite a bit. Speaking of truncation again, what we're focusing now is on what's called the initial operating segment, which would go between the great metropolises of Merced and Bakersfield. So how did we get here as the initial operating segment? As I've mentioned several times, Prop 1A approved for $9 billion in bonds and it's important to remember that sometimes people say, oh, they said this was only going to cost $9 billion. Prop 1A approved $9 billion in bonds for high-speed rail to start the system. Even at that time, the estimates, very optimistic for the total cost, were $33 billion in 2008 dollars for this system. And if you translate that into year of expenditure, the year when accounting for inflation, in the years that the money would actually be spent, it's about $64 billion. So the system costs have inflated essentially as much as doubled, but it's not, nobody ever thought the system would be built for $9 billion. So the bonds were approved. There was a lot of legislative hurdles to clear. Environmental approvals had environmental clearance, environmental studies had to be done. And then there were a series of lawsuits, especially by farmers, large landowners in the Central Valley, who were not happy with routes that went through their particular properties. So actual construction didn't begin until 2015. And in 2015, construction began on what's referred to as the initial construction segment. This was divided into 4 packages. And this is the segment that is actually under active construction right now. The expectation at the time would be that in addition to the Prop 1A money, there would be money from federal grants, some of which materialized, but not as much as expected, and from private investors, essentially none of which materialized. It's kind of hard to get private investors to be excited about a system where the coverage is, it's not clear how long it's going to take to get the full 6 system built, how much it will cost. There's a lot of criticism, justifiably so, of the management of this project in the early years, especially around 2010, 2014. A lot of poor decisions were made. One of those was to start construction early in the Central Valley, primarily because some of the federal money that was available required what were called shovel-ready projects, which means that construction had to start right away. Environmental planning was farthest along in the Central Valley, so they decided to start construction there. Unfortunately, they did not have full right-of-way. They hadn't purchased all the properties along the right-of-way. Full plant design and planning hadn't been completed for the whole segment. So it's kind of, building the plane while it's in flight, and a lot of decisions were made that inflated costs and stretched out the timeline. Management of the project has gotten much better in recent years, but we're still dealing with some of the consequences of this poor start. In 2019, during the state address, Gavin Newsom basically acknowledged that the funding wasn't coming forward as expected, and that the funding that was identified was not enough to build phase 1. Originally, the idea was to start in the Central Valley, just keep building out in both directions until it was all done. That really didn't happen. And Newsom said, realistically, we have to look at what we can build with the funding that's available. So he said, we're going to designate the initial operating segment, and this was in consultation with the High-Speed Rail Authority and the legislature. We're going to designate Merced Bakersfield as our initial operating segment. So on the map you see there, the green section is the initial construction. That's essentially fully funded. We have high confidence that that can be completed. The extensions to Merced and Bakersfield are going to require additional funding. So this is what we're looking at now as the initial operating segment, 171 miles out of the 494 for phase one that would run from Merced to Bakersfield. And I didn't put the percentage of the population. We went from 93 to 77. The folks who actually live in the Central Valley, we're looking at about 6% of the California population living in this region. Whether starting in the Central Valley was a really good idea is highly debatable, but that's where we are. How would this factor into connecting San Francisco and Los Angeles? What you're getting is a marginal improvement. Instead of taking the San Joaquins all the way to Bakersfield, you take the San Joaquins to Merced, then you get on the high-speed rail, and then at Bakersfield, you transfer from high-speed rail to the bus again, basically from the 21st century back to the 20th century. But it does, that high-speed rail segment is enough to cut off about 2 hours. So instead of 9.5 hours, we're now looking at about 7.5 hours to travel from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Not enough to be competitive with air or driving for most people. I think there'll be a few people just out of the interest to try high-speed rail who might try this once or twice. Significantly improved service for the folks who already use the lines, but this is not going to be something that's going to compel a lot of people to say, hey, yeah, I'm going to switch to rail between San Francisco and LA. On the other hand, one of the most disingenuous arguments that's sometimes made against high-speed rail is folks saying, oh, they haven't laid a single mile of track. That's not how you build a rail system. You first prepare the rail bed, you first prepare the guideways and the structures that you need. So there is actually quite a bit going on in the current construction segment. And within that 119 mile initial segment, about 96 out of 119 guideway miles have been completed. If you look on Google Earth or any satellite photos, you can now actually trace out the route of high-speed rail just looking at the guideway that's existing on the ground. Out of the structures, viaducts, overpasses, and so on, there's about 91 that are needed. 50 of those are roughly done. I think there's a couple more been completed since I last saw the numbers. 35 more under construction. So about 85 out of 91 are either done or under construction. Pretty much all the structures will be either done or under construction by next year. And they should be able to start laying track, finally, laying rail by next year, 2026. And this initial segment, again, we're talking only about the segment in green, should be ready for testing by about 2028. So by 2028, we should actually see high-speed rail trains running in the Central Valley, which I think will be a big psychological boost for the project. I actually wanted to see the construction, so I drove down through the Central Valley and looked at some of these sites in early March. Some of the best videos, though, are coming from folks. There's different drone enthusiasts who live in the Central Valley who love to fly their drones along this and get videos. This is a guy who goes by Jason Droning Around, and this is crossing Highway 70 near. This is basically Highway 99, which is the primary highway through the Central Valley. This is a 0.7 mile structure that takes you across 99 and into the rail yards. You can see downtown Fresno in the distance, and this is completed. If you go about 30 miles to the south, this is the Kings Tulare station. This is a viaduct over Highway 198 that runs between Hanford and Visalia. And then off to the left, you can see this larger structure, which actually the whole thing stretches for about 1.5 miles. This larger structure is the platform on which they're going to build the Kings Tulare station. And when I was out there in March, I took a picture of this. It's a pretty impressive structure. Hard to get a sense of the scale here, but it's about 55 or 60 feet high. And it turns out that there were some architectural renderings that were released last year and drawn from not too far from where I took this picture. So this gives a little bit of a sense of what it would be like to have having the canopy for the rail station on top of the viaduct. There is a lot of value engineering going on, the term dreaded by all architects. Basically trying to, they're working very hard right now to improve cost efficiencies. And so we're probably going to lose some features, like I'm sure the little fountain with the kids out in front is not going to happen, especially in the initial phase, because the ridership just from Merced Bakersfield is not really high enough to necessitate the full station. And in fact, the plan is ultimately for the rail to be double tracked, but the initial Merced Bakersfield probably doesn't have enough demand for that. So they'll probably be single tracking that section. So there's a lot of work on cost savings. But as I said, construction is very active. And this is another bridge. This bridge is about 9 miles north of where we were just in the last picture. This is a bridge that would take high-speed rail across Highway 43, which is one of the highways that takes traffic north-south in the valley. This is pretty much what it looked like when I went by in early March. And Jason Dronin around has been flying drones by, updating the progress. And the key thing here is just to notice that the construction is active and that there's a lot of progress being made. And these are some of the fancier, bigger, more impressive structures. Most of these 91 structures are things like simple overpasses. So this is a picture I took in early March. I was on one recently completed overpass looking towards another. And you can also see the guideway. Most of the guideway looks like this. It's just a raised berm with a flattened surface ready for rails to be laid down. So that's the active construction segment. That's pretty far along. How do we fund the full Merced Bakersfield? Let's talk a little bit about money and how we're paying for this, or what the plans are to try to pay for this system. The most recent report was the 2024 business plan. This came out in early 2024, and there have been a lot of changes in the meantime. So a lot of this is somewhat out of date, and we'll talk about that. There is a 2025 business plan that should be released next month, and that's where we expect to see some updates. But as of 2024, the High Speed Rail Authority was estimating that this system would cost the total cost, including money that's already been spent, would be somewhere between 32.1 and 35.3 billion. So obviously we want to budget for the high end costs. We don't want to run short of money. So this is basically showing out of the 35.3 billion, about 21.7 billion. This is money that's already been secured, allocated, in many cases already spent. 21.7 allocated, 13.6 billion still needed. So let's first look at the money that's already been allocated. Where's that coming from? There's three major sources of funding. The initial Prop 1A bonds accounts for about 8.5 billion. The federal grants, there were two chunks of federal grants. Most around 2000, there was about half around 2009, 2010 under the Obama administration. Then another chunk of grants that came in 2023 under the Biden administration, adding up to about 6.8 billion. The other major source is labeled GGRF here. This is greenhouse gas reduction funds. When it became clear in the early 2010s that there was not going to be a lot of private funding supported, Jerry Brown, who was a big supporter of high-speed rail, and the legislature basically by law designated 25% of these funds to high-speed rail. Greenhouse gas reduction funds are proceeds from the cap and trade program. Cap and trade program, large emitters need to buy permits for their emissions at an auction, and there's quarterly auctions. And since 2014, from the state portion of those proceeds, 1/4 have gone to high-speed rail. And in recent years, that's been right around $1 billion a year that's gone to high-speed rail. And the 6.4 billion is as of the end of 2023, when the business plan was published. About another billion have come in since then. So that if we look at this money that we still need, We know that greenhouse gas reduction funds are still coming in. And so a conservative estimate of what that would be is about 7.1 billion. In fact, about $1 billion of this has already come in since the end of 2023. One of the real difficulties with relying on greenhouse gas reduction funds is they come at an annual auction, which means you don't, or at quarterly auctions, so you don't know from one quarter to the next exactly how much money is going to come in. And it's a program, the cap and trade program is only authorized through 2030. So this is a funding source that could, in theory, go away in 2030. We expect that it's going to be extended, but the discussions are still ongoing on that. So that leaves what's usually referred to as the funding gap of $6.5 billion. So how does the 2024 business plan propose to fill that funding gap? Well, first off, 7.1 billion is a very conservative estimate. It's pretty plausible that there would be at least another 1.8 billion in funding. So now that brings our gap down to 4.7 billion. So where's that going to come from? In early 2024, the high-speed rail authority's answer was, well, we're going to get more federal grants. We're going to get 4.7 billion in federal grants. Even at the time, there was some doubt about this. The high-speed rail authority, one of the things that was instituted, a reform that's come in the last couple of years, is the institution of an inspector general's office, an independent branch, which is really helpful to be sure that they're keeping they're realistic in their assumptions. And the inspector general's office says, this doesn't seem realistic to us. It assumes you're going to get 100% of the grants that you applied for. And that's just not something that seems very plausible. Ironically, this report was issued at the very end of October, about a week before the 2024 presidential election. And of course, with the new administration coming in, this kind of blew up, and we're back to 4.7 billion gap that we don't have a solid plan for funding at this point. Again, there's a new business plan expected next month. It's going to be very interesting to see what the projections are. There's value engineering, as I mentioned, going on. There is looking for efficiencies, looking at all kinds of ways to reduce cost. But on the other hand, we have inflation, and especially with tariffs that are kind of on and off, we're not sure what's going to happen with tariffs. Costs may be higher. And in fact, an early version of the 2025 report that's been circulating is looking at the higher costs at the high end. It's not clear yet where we are at the low end or what the most likely figure is, but the projection is that the high end cost could go from about 35.3 up to 38.5 billion. That takes our 6.5 billion structure, 6.5 billion shortfall up to something closer to $10 billion. So this is looking pretty serious. And this was actually originally broken by KCRA-TV in Sacramento late last month. At the same time, there was positive news last month. As I mentioned this before, Governor Newsom has proposed extension of the cap and trade program, which apparently is now being rebranded as Cap and Invest, from basically extended to run not till 2030, but till 2050. And he proposed a straightforward extension of the program and proposed that a minimum $1 billion be guaranteed for high-speed rail. Some high-speed rail advocates are disappointed by this. They were hoping for 2 or 3 billion, but this is really important for high-speed rail because if there's a guaranteed amount, you can go to the bond market, you can go to banks looking for loans that would bring more of that money, basically shift the money forward. You get a loan, so you get more of the money earlier to accelerate construction. It's hard to do that if you go to the banks and say, hey, my income source, I'm not really sure what it's going to be. It varies quarter to quarter, and it might go away in 2030. If you have 20-year guarantee with a specific known amount, that makes it easier. This proposal was not included in the budget that the legislature passed last week. That doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, but basically the legislature said there's a lot of of discussion about reform of the cap and trade or cap and invest system. And we want to have a more thorough discussion about that. And that will likely include some kind of funding for high-speed rail, but whether it will include this guaranteed minimum is not clear at this point. So that's an ongoing discussion. And since we had a piece of good news, we have to have some more bad news. The Trump administration sent a letter, it's through the Federal Railroad Authority at the beginning of this month, and basically announced to the High-Speed Rail Authority its intent to try to pull back $4 billion in funding from already awarded federal grants. So some of that federal money that's already awarded may be pulled back. This is going to go, there's going to be court challenges. This is going to be, it's going to be a fairly drawn out discussion, but it clearly is not going to create investor confidence that, hey, yeah, you're on a stable funding basis right now. Also, the Trump administration has basically argued against that they are going to try to basically abolish the whole cap and trade system, that they're arguing that it's not really illegal. So things will be uncertain for a while. So the construction is underway, and there is a fallback. If Merced Bakersfield can't be completed, you could actually run service between Madera and Shafter at the south end of the line. And again, announcing Madera Shafter's service is not too impressive, but it's something that we could actually get high-speed rail running, test it out, and be ready when funding becomes available. So, and that California does have the capacity through the if cap and trade survives, the capacity to complete Merced Bakersfield, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. Thinking, yeah, I'm an optimist. I don't see the glass as 2/3 empty. I see it as 1/3 full. But yeah, at some point, hopefully, we're going to be able to move forward. And what are the plans for going beyond Bakersfield, beyond the Merced Bakersfield segment, and building out the phase 1 system? As I mentioned, for Merced Bakersfield, let's assume that sometime in the 2030s, we are able to get the funding and complete this system. Where do we go next? And there's been a lot of discussion about whether you build up towards San Francisco or south towards Los Angeles. Last August, the High-Speed Rail Authority hired a new CEO, Ian Chaudhry, who has significant experience with mega projects. A lot of this value engineering that I've talked about has been under his leadership. And he's proposed actually going in both directions a little ways. So building a system that would run from Gilroy to Palmdale for about 334 miles. This doubles the amount of the mileage of the system from Merced Bakersfield and kind of pushes us towards the 494 miles for phase 1. And you can react, geez, could they not have at least one city that somebody outside of California would recognize on this line? But there is some logic here. The idea of Gilroy Palmdale is that you're getting to a point where you can basically tie into existing regional rail systems. So if we look at the south end of the system from Palmdale, there's a Metrolink line that already runs along, it's the Antelope Valley line that runs from Los Angeles up to Palmdale and could provide rail service south to Los Angeles. At the north end, Caltrain runs a service already from San Francisco to Gilroy. So you now, finally, we don't need a bus with Gilroy Palmdale. You can actually go from San Francisco and you don't need to wind around north from Oakland to get into Central Valley. So you do have direct rail service from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Still 2 transfers though. And the estimated time for this would be, these are my best estimates based on the numbers I can find. We're looking in the vicinity of 6 hours from San Francisco, Los Angeles. competitive with driving time now, still a little bit long compared to flying, and you've got 2 transfers. However, folks in the Bay Area, you may be aware that San Francisco to San Jose has been electrified, and that's really increased speeds along the line and increased ridership. San Jose Gilroy is still diesel service, but there are plans with high-speed rail to electrify that. If that service could be electrified, then we could get what's called a blended service. And the plan has always been to run high-speed rail through the peninsula along the Caltrain corridor. To get full high-speed rail along that corridor, you would need to build additional trackage, because you're accommodating Caltrain, you're accommodating freight, and you're accommodating high-speed rail. But you could cut off some more time, potentially cutting travel times now to 5 hours. So each little bit gets you a bit more. Now we're getting to the point where this is starting to look possibly competitive with flying. If you don't want to be going through airport security lines and jammed into the economy section of a plane, then this might be an attractive alternative. The other potential advantage of Palmdale that High Speed Rail Authority is talking about is that it could tie in to what they're calling the Southwest Network. So I mentioned Brightline West running from Las Vegas to Rancho Cucamonga. There is a plan still just on the drawing boards, but there is some funding available. This is basically a line that was originally going to be a freeway, but is now planned to be a high-speed rail line connecting Palmdale and Victor Valley, called the High Desert Corridor. If that line is built, and Gilroy Palmdale is built, and the timeline for this, even with money from investors, we're looking at probably the mid-2040s, by which time the High Desert Corridor may well be in place. Now you've got high-speed service from San Francisco to Las Vegas. That may be a point where you can start attracting investors, that there may be some possibility of getting significant revenue from the system. Again, all this speculative, we're talking about the 2040s. But at this point, we're getting very close to the phase 1 system. So what is the total cost of the phase 1 system? Again, most recent estimate is from the 2024 business plan. At that time, the estimate is low end 89 billion, high end 128 billion, with a base cost that's sort of most probable of 106 billion. These are big numbers. These are numbers that kind of get people's eyes watering. But it is, if we look at the numbers, and again, we in 2025 plan, these numbers may increase, but there's also significant effort to decrease the costs, especially by reducing the need for tunneling, so that the costs could also come down. I expect it'll be a little bit of both. And this is a lot of money to spend. Why should we spend this much money? One answer is we're going to have to spend money anyway, because transportation demand continues to increase. If we don't build high-speed rail, then we're looking at increasing the capacity of highways and airports, building additional runways, building additional highway lanes, which will likely increase emissions. There's not a really good strategy right now to decarbonize air travel. We are hoping to shift cars to the electric battery operation, but we don't know how long that's going to take. And these corridors are already significantly congested. The High Speed Rail Authority did a study in 2019, updated in 2023, saying what would it cost to build equivalent transportation capacity by expanding highways and airports, building runways, building new gates, building new lanes for highways. And the estimate is that for equivalent capacity, it would cost about twice as much. So we're looking at significant investment either way, but much more expensive and higher emitting to do this through highway and air travel. So The other alternative, of course, is not to spend any of this money and just face increasing congestion. Basically, California economy kind of choking on the congestion of our highways and air traffic. Building high-speed rail means we have a third transportation system. We have another option which does not have the same congestion levels, is not constrained in the same way. And high-speed rail is seen as one part of a real transformation in transportation in California. We're talking about a true mode shift away from relying solely on cars with rail as another option. And that includes intercity rail, regional rail, as well as high-speed rail. The 2024 State Rail Plan anticipates between now and 2050 $307 billion in investments. Some of this is money that's already budgeted. Some of this is money that would need to be found. But this would really transformation, make rail a viable option, not just for San Francisco, LA, but regionally as well. And the projection is, and this is generally true for high-speed rail, the money you spend up front produces much larger increases in economic output. So their estimate is a $307 billion investment would generate about $537 billion in economic output. So that's the financial benefits. What's the climate benefit? We're Climate Action California. We kind of care about this stuff. What's the climate benefit from high-speed rail? Well, it's important to note that high-speed rail is just one piece of the solution. If we look at our total emissions in California, this is 2022, transportation is the single largest sector of emissions in California. But if we break that down, this is now the percentage of transportation emissions from each source. About 93% of those emissions are either from passenger vehicles or heavy-duty vehicles, mainly freight trucks. Rail is only about 0.8% of emissions, and the vast majority of that is from freight rail, diesel freight rail, not passenger rail. So the savings in emissions just from people taking an electric high-speed train instead of a diesel low-speed train is minuscule. The big shifts, the big emission benefits come from mode shifts, from getting people to move from passenger vehicles and intrastate flights to rail. Very hard to predict what this mode shift is going to be. Numbers are kind of all over the place. So I've put a little caveat here. This is speculative numbers alert. These are numbers, these are the High-Speed Rail Authority numbers, but I've run other back of the envelope calculations, and they all are in the same ballpark, which is a pretty broad ballpark. So first, what are the emissions reductions we're looking at? And I call it the plausible range. This is looking, for example, at California High-Speed Rail Authority's estimates for the first 50 years of operation of the system. This would average anywhere from about 500,000 to 3 million tons of CO2 emissions per year. CO2 equivalent, but most of this is actual carbon dioxide emissions. Their estimates are actually between 580,000 and 2,840,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. But this is pretty close to other calculations that I've seen. How much is that costing per ton of CO2 that we're taking out of the atmosphere? Now we're looking at, do we talk about the high-end cost or the low-end cost? Do we look at the high-end emissions reduction or the low end? So the range is very broad and speculative, but the cost per ton using those figures range anywhere from $600 to $5,000 per ton. Looking at sort of the middle range, we're probably talking about between 1,000 and 2,000 per ton, but it could be any place in this range. Key point here is this is expensive. This is, if we're looking at things like direct air capture, trying to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, that's running about $1,000 per ton now, maybe a little bit less, 600 to 1,000. And folks are saying that's way too expensive. It's not economically feasible. So if high-speed rail was simply some big machine, some big system to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and did nothing else, we'd say this is too much. This is ridiculous. We can't pay that much per ton. But it's important to remember that that's not what high-speed rail is. It's a system to transport people from one place in California to another. It provides economic and employment opportunities. It then again, the economic benefits are estimated to outweigh the costs over the long run. So this is why it's just looking at the efficiency of removing carbon is not the best metric. We have a lot of programs. There are programs that are environmental justice programs that do have very high costs per ton avoided, but are also accomplishing other important goals. So what I would conclude from this is you can't justify the cost of high-speed rail by emissions reductions. Environmental groups I support high-speed rail in part because of the emissions reductions, but just the emissions reductions aren't going to justify that cost. High-speed rail is really going to provide long-term benefits for mobility of Californians, economic benefits, especially for areas like the Central Valley, and significant employment benefits, as well as the environmental benefits. So it can't be justified on environmental benefits alone, but it provides those environmental benefits in addition to all the other benefits that are provided. So in conclusion, if you, after all this, and again, people can come to different conclusions here, but I believe the long-term benefits significantly outweigh the costs. So the question is, what can I do? One is you can ask state representatives to support stable, guaranteed funding for high-speed rail. That's what will allow the system to expand at something approaching a reasonable rate. And talk to your family, your friends, other folks about progress and benefits of high-speed rail, but also be realistic about what it's going to cost and what the challenges are. There is a lot of folks who think, oh, high-speed rail has failed, nothing's happening at all. There are other folks who think, hey, this is the magic bullet that's going to completely remove emissions in California. California is one of the only states in the country that has the resources and the political will to build a system like this. And the long-term benefits could be very significant, but the upfront costs are very high. A couple of other items not so directly related to high-speed rail. One is transit. We talked about how a mode shift requires not just high-speed rail, also regional intercity rail, also transit within cities. And Governor Newsom in his May revise proposed removing $1.5 billion of greenhouse gas reduction funds for transit and redirecting that towards CAL FIRE. That would be disastrous for public transit and killing functioning public transit now that is going to be needed immediately, as well as having synergetic effects with high-speed rail in the future, makes no sense. The legislature has rejected those cuts, and the budget proposal that was passed last week is basically restored those cuts and added some additional funds for agencies that are facing fiscal cliffs. So asking Newsom, who does have a line item veto and may or may not support the legislature's proposed budget, to support restored funding for transit. And by the way, I'll put in the chat a couple of links from organizations to where you can actually contact your representatives. Move California has a letter basically encouraging Newsom to support restored funding for transit. And also, a lot of the costs that we're facing are coming from damages from fossil fuel emissions. The polluters pay bills, which are right now stuck in the judiciary committees in the houses of the legislature, would provide significant funding. They require fossil fuel companies to pay into funds to support, basically to offset some of the damage that has already been done from their emissions. So those are some of the primary ways that you can support polluters pay. And at that point, I've gone about 10 minutes over what I'd hoped. And but we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. I'm willing to stick around as long as folks want to ask questions, at least another 15, 20 minutes. But at this point, I think I'll open it up for questions, and I'll stick those links in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was a powerhouse of a presentation. I learned so much, and I really appreciate how well organized it was and anticipating a lot of questions. So we got a lot of great questions in the chat. I've organized them into four categories. And I also just want to say, with my hat as volunteer coordinator on, one of the links that Jonathan will put in the chat is to join us. And if you'd like to get involved, we have lots of great roles for volunteers, whether you have a little bit of time or a lot. And if you fill out the form, I will be happy to meet with you and help you find your place. So we'd love to have you. All right, so the four categories that the questions seem to fall in are quickies. There's three ones I can ask you real quick in the beginning, Jonathan. Then there's several about money and cost, some about siting, and then political calculations, which to me is very interesting. So I encourage you, Jonathan, to just give quickie answers too, so we don't get bogged down to anyone. Some of
Yeah.
these you actually answered or answered the chat, but for those who are watching the recording, I want to make sure everybody has access to these answers. So the first question was, or the first quickie is, um, with the high-speed rail project, is there a commitment to electric trains?
Yes, that is absolute. Electric trains, renewable power. That's a core feature.
Fantastic. Next one is, when will iOS be operational?
The target date is between 2030 and 2033. That was in the 2024 business plan. Obviously, with all the wrangling over funding, we'll see what the update is in the July plan. But that was the initial target.
And can you say what the acronym stands for, iOS?
Initial operating segment. That's the Merced Bakersfield segment that we were talking about.
Okay, great. And the last quickie was, how does this compare with East Coast Rail?
East Coast, there is Acela. This is the densest rail corridor running from Washington, D.C. up through New York and Boston. Acela is sort of nominally high-speed train. It can travel up to 150 miles per hour, but it only does that over about 10% of its trackage. So the actual average speeds are not that much better than conventional rail, sadly. It is electric, though.
Okay, great. All right, on to questions about money. It seems to be a very important topic.
Yeah.
Lily asks, has there been any analysis about how much money high-speed rail will save in highway maintenance, given forecasted increased capacity and demand? Or does the estimated comparison you provided include maintenance?
That's a good question. My understanding is that estimate, that capacity study we looked at, is only construction of new lanes and airport capacity versus construction of high-speed rail. There would be, and there's maintenance obviously for the high-speed rail and operational costs, but it also brings in revenue. So yeah, the short answer is I haven't seen a study. There may be one, but I haven't seen one on the maintenance costs. Whoop, just went, sorry, you're muted.
How strange. Okay, that seems like a very important point about the maintenance savings as well.
Yes.
Great. And then there was a clarification question about when you referenced $1 billion, was it a billion in total or per year? And
Uh,
is that a floor or it
yes.
does the state sees fit?
Thanks. That's an important point. Yes, it is 1 billion per year, and it is a floor. So it would be the larger of 25% of the greenhouse gas reduction funds, or 1 billion. So at least 1 billion more in years when the auctions bring in more money.
Okay, great. Um, Then the other question is there a revenue projection for the Merced Bakersfield route and for a future Los Angeles San Francisco rail? Is there also a projection of statewide economic benefits? So first, revenue projection for Merced to Bakersfield route and a future Los Angeles San Francisco route.
I will have to look back. The revenue projection is not high. There are costs for operating, and Merced Bakersfield, the ridership is not going to be huge. So but the estimate is that it will not cost, that it will be similar to the existing San Joaquin service. It will not actually add costs because the high-speed rail will be replacing the existing diesel trains, but it's probably also not going to result in a significant increase. Cost benefit for phase one costs are around, as I said, 130 billion. Benefit economic activity increase is somewhere in the vicinity of 200 billion. So far on Merced Bakersfield, this was as of a year or two ago, they'd spent $12 billion and estimated $20 billion in economic benefits. And a lot of that is from the construction activity. There, again, 1,500 workers at any one time, about 15,000 jobs in total. This has been a significant source of employment.
Wow, fascinating. And what about the revenue projection for the Los Angeles to
Oh,
Mexico Rail? That's going to be a
that
bigger metropolitan area, do you think?
yes, that's much harder to gauge at this point. I would have to look. I'm sure there are projections, but anything that far out, I don't know how solid that would be. But
Yeah.
and again, it really depends if you've also got the connection to Brightline West and to Las Vegas. You know, system revenues could be significant.
Okay, great. Another money question was actually kind of a comment, but I think it might fold into a question. I wish the authority could raise money by selling carbon offset credits. Is there any hope of that?
That it's I have not heard that discussed. Offsets is a very tricky discussion, but these would be much more plausible. You still have to calculate the avoided CO2 emissions from trips there. But yeah, I have not seen that. That's an interesting question. I'll look into that, but I have not heard. The main things I've heard are discussions of bonds and low interest loans to pull the funding forward.
Okay, great. On to the siting considerations.
Mhm.
Um, why not do it along State Route 99 using that row? They wouldn't be able to do it along the 99 for the entire thing, but 99 does hit in many of those major metropolitan areas you were talking about.
Yeah, this gets it can get a little bit wonky, but the basic idea is that 99, this was a freeway that was built quite a while ago. There's not a lot of room for expansion along that corridor. There's not like open land right next to it. So if you're going along 99, you would be looking at lots of sections where you'd have to actually build elevated viaduct in the center, and that just is prohibitively expensive. Brightline is taking open median that has not been built on, and so it's much less expensive that way. But unfortunately, along the 99 corridor, it's quite congested.
Yeah, makes sense. Why wouldn't the connection be from Los Angeles to Rancho Cucamonga, or be an extension of either the high-speed rail or Brightline West to connect the two instead of a third service?
Basically, I mean, both are contemplated. In phase two, there would be a connection there. The reason for the high desert corridor, which does seem like a weird place to build high speed rail, is that there was a proposal for a new freeway that would be funded. And I'm trying to remember the exact proposition, but it's one of the LA propositions, transportation propositions, to fund a freeway between Victor Valley and Palmdale. And a couple of climate groups sued, pointing out that this kind of is a wee bit inconsistent with the state priority of reducing vehicle miles traveled and reducing new freeways, and actually prevailed so that that money is now being set aside for this high desert corridor, which would actually be high speed, both passenger and freight, probably running freight more at night, but running passenger rail during most of the day.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now onto the political calculations. Um, do you know how the leading candidates for governor see this issue?
It's it's interesting. The only candidate that I know of who has expressed opposition to high-speed rail was Katie Porter, and yeah, it is a high-cost project, no question. But apparently, she got a lot of pushback very quickly from unions who see this as a jobs creator, and so she's kind of pulled back her criticism. Also, the one as silver lining of the actions by the current federal administration is that it's basically pulling the Democratic legislators, candidates, everyone's kind of bonding together uh, at varying levels of support for high speed rail. It's opposing high speed rail looks like you're aligning yourself with the current federal administration, which isn't popular here. So there's generally levels of support from strong to tepid.
Very interesting. Um, Another question is, are the ice raids affecting construction, the labor that people
Not,
are?
yeah, not that I've heard. And probably not best to give the federal government any ideas about other ways to mess with high-speed rail. But honestly, I don't know what I don't know the employment. These are high-paying jobs, and there's a lot of competition for these jobs. I don't know how many, the status of workers there, but that's I have not heard anything about ICE raids
Melanie
on the
points out she
construction
assumes they're
sites.
probably union workers. So,
I think they're yeah. I think a large percentage. I'm not sure if all, but a large percentage are basically are unionized. So
mhm.
yeah,
And then is there talk of high-speed freight beyond the high desert corridor?
not that I've heard of. Certainly not the part of the fundamental principles for the California high speed rail is that it will be passenger rail. I don't know if Brightline has any interest in trying to run freight, but they have been promoted as it's been promoted as passenger rail.
Okay. And then politically too, like which groups or sectors are in the coalition for high-speed rail, and how can we grow the coalition? Which groups are missing that would be good to reach out to?
There is generally a lot of environmental groups are do not have strong support. I mean, this is an issue that there's a lot of environmental groups who I don't. There are very few who oppose it, but that I know of. But some of the big groups, and I don't know specific positions for specific groups, but a lot of them are kind of holding off because the emissions benefits are not huge. To, for me, and by the way, Climate Action California adopted an official position, which is we support completion of Merced Bakersfield segment, and we look forward to a financial plan for completing the system. It's yeah, so it's not yeah, yay, high speed rail, go. I think all the groups are looking at if we get in competition, if high speed rail, in this case, for example, the cut that Newsom proposed for transit funding was to fund not high speed rail, but to fund CAL FIRE. But if it comes down to a head to head between high speed rail and transit, that's difficult because transit is serving people now across, across the state and all kinds of income levels. Transit is vital. And so a lot of environmental organizations are looking at transit, but I believe high speed rail has a really important long term synergistic effect in supporting transit, supporting regional and intercity rail. We really need to get a mode shift. Ideally, we get that mode shift at all levels and all trip lengths that we're looking at.
Yeah, very nice context to that. I love that. So those were the questions that were submitted. One person had asked for your email address, so I did put that in the chat because you had it on your first slide. But for those
Yes,
who don't know, do you want to just share it again for people to?
sure. I'll put it in the chat again.
And also, there were some really excellent comments in the chat, and I made a note of some of them. Not sure if you want me to read any highlights, or we can maybe share the chat afterwards. But I just thought it was a very high quality discussion in the chat, and I appreciate everybody who made great
Yeah.
comments and questions.
And I did see one comment. I'm just getting a chance to look at some of these now from Sierra Club Loma Prieta. Yes to emissions reductions, no to destruction of wildlife habitat. Yeah, absolutely. There are concerns about that. There's been a lot of work. There are a lot of underpasses in areas where high-speed rail runs through wildlands to provide corridors for wildlife to pass across the line. There's a significant chunk between Merced and Gilroy where it goes through protected habitats where the birds might be disturbed by high-speed rail trains whooshing through. And there's actually a plan to have a cover over the track, basically sort of a canopy covering the track to minimize that kind of disruption. So there has been a lot of work on reducing wildlife impact, which is absolutely critical.
Wow, great. And maybe I could just wrap up with a, a personal sharing that Glenn provided at the very beginning. But he shared that in late April, he just took China's high-speed rail train, And the
Mhm.
top speed it reached was 195 miles per hour. It was very nice and convenient. And so it's
Yeah,
great to have that personal testimonial of just
yeah,
how wonderful it can be to travel on high-speed rail. And I made the comment
yeah,
for this to the fourth largest economy in the world to have such a convoluted way to traverse this state
mhm,
on old-fashioned technology seems really incredulous. And this seems like
yeah.
our state should be doing this. So that's my
Yeah, yeah, actually, let's get into a competition. Actually, fastest I run, I was in 2004 in China. There was a very short segment in Shanghai that goes out to the airport, and I got to ride on that. That topped out at 267 miles per hour. So fastest I've ever traveled over land. But yeah, it was quite impressive.
wow, that's truly amazing. All right. Well, someone put in the chat that it was an probably excellent information. People are really appreciating. I thought I was just super impressed with the detail you provided, and thank you so much for the time you put
Oh,
into preparing this.
of
Thanks to
course, of
everybody who
course.
came. We do hope
Thank
you'll,
yes.
yeah, take some of those calls to action, do what you can to build support, and please reach out if you'd like to volunteer with Climate Action California. Yeah. Any
Thank you.
final comments?
And email with any questions. Yeah, absolutely.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Well, thank you all. Good night.